Welcome to Business Review, a daily program that delves into the latest and most significant economic stories. From stock markets to currency news, Business Review covers the most up-to-date developments in the global financial world.
As the indicators that measure Argentina's stuttering economy contract and decline, one figure in particular is impacting an entire generation: unemployed adults. Marcelo Chivets, a 59-year-old owner of kayak factory, said that in the last 3 years his manufacturing has plummeted. In the past he had 45 workers, now only 16 people are working in his company. Argentina's unemployment rate rose to 9.7% in the third quarter of 2019, almost a percentage point higher than a year earlier. Sergio Anibal Katz was fired 4 months ago from the factory, where he worked for around 11 years, and said that he has been searching for a job but confessed the situation is very hard. Katz, who has more than 10 years of experience, said that he has started to eat more carbohydrates and less meat. Peronist President Alberto Fernandez has promised an end to outgoing leader Mauricio Macri's pro-business policies as inflation roars at above 50%. Poverty has grown and economic growth sputters. Argentina's economy is shrinking and poverty levels are approaching 40%. The country, Latin America's number 3 economy, also needs to restructure a large pile of sovereign debt with creditors.
China said it firmly opposes the United States' abuse of export control measures to interfere with the normal cooperation between businesses after it was reported that the Trump administration is planning to limit exports of sophisticated technology to adversaries like China. Speaking at a regular news conference in Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang said limiting tech exports will not disrupt China's innovation or development. A document shows the U.S. Commerce Department is putting the finishing touches on 5 rules covering products like quantum computing and 3D printing technologies that were mandated by a 2018 law to keep sensitive technologies out of the hands of rival powers. In a move that should appeal to U.S. firms, the rules will be submitted to international bodies for approval so that it may be implemented overseas, not just by the United States.
Dutch farmers blocked a motorway with tractors in protest against government plans to limit nitrogen emissions. The Dutch government said in October it would spend hundreds of millions of euros to mitigate nitrogen emissions after the country's highest court ruled in May that the way Dutch farmers and builders dealt with nitrogen emissions breached European law. The government said it would offer subsidies to farmers who are either willing to give up their business or want to invest in limiting their emissions. Nitrogen emissions, which in large quantities threaten specific types of plants and the animals that feed on them, are relatively high in the small but densely populated Netherlands, home to important industries and a large agricultural sector.
A burnt Christmas tree made from charred logs and other bushfire remnants has been set up in Sydney's central business district in a poignant reminder of the deadly bushfires that have ravaged much of Australia. The installation, made of signed tree limbs, a scorched bicycle, a ruined fire alarm and other household debris left behind by the life-threatening fires, is surrounded by Christmas presents wrapped in glittery red, silver and gold papers. Artist James Dive said the artwork was a symbol of the shadow that bushfires have cast over the festive season, as well as the resilience of Australian communities. The installation was created in partnership with the Red Cross and the city of Sydney. As many as 6 people have died in the state of New South Wales, of which Sydney is the capital city, in the current bushfires, with more than 700 homes destroyed and nearly 3 million acres of land burnt. Fire authorities in New South Wales said there were 99 fires still burning, half of which were not contained.
Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot maker PSA have reached a binding agreement over their roughly $50 billion merger that will reshape the global car industry. France's PSA and Italian-American Fiat Chrysler, which are yet to decide on a name for their new company, will now start work on delivering their pledge to cut costs by $4.1 billion a year without closing factories. That will be all the harder with politicians and strong labor unions in both France and Italy worried about job losses at a combined business that will employ around 400,000 people. In Frankfurt, car industry analyst Jürgen Weiber of Metzler Bank said that while PSA was looking for size, Fiat Chrysler did not have a choice since Fiat's technology is out of date. Weiber said that the merged company would have to take a close look at Fiat's Italian factories, where a lot of cleanup work is required. Asked about the future of PSA German unit Opel, Weiber said the brand from Rüsselsheim outside Frankfurt stood out as one of the bright lights destined for a bright future.
The U.S. House of Representatives approved a $1.4 trillion spending package to avert a partial government shutdown that also would raise the U.S. tobacco purchasing age to 21 and permanently repeal several of the Affordable Care Act's taxes. The spending package now heads to the Senate, where lawmakers aim to approve it before current government funding runs out, avoiding the type of messy budget battles that resulted in a record 35-day interruption of government services late last year and early this year. The legislation worked out between leading lawmakers and the Trump administration denies President Donald Trump the full $5 billion he requested to help build his signature wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, keeping funding static at $1.37 billion for border barriers. The crackdown on youth smoking by changing the minimum age for cigarettes, vaping devices, and other tobacco purchases to 21 from the current 18 would give the U.S. Food and Drug Administration 6 months to develop regulations. The agency would then have 3 years to work with states on implementing the change. The largest expenditure in the bill is for the Department of Defense, which would get a total of $738 billion for this year, $22 billion more than last year. As part of that defense package, the Senate authorized the creation of Trump's Space Force, the first new branch of the U.S. military to be created in more than 60 years. It also gives federal employees 12 weeks of paid parental leave. The overall spending deal does not include big-ticket benefit programs like Social Security and Medicare, which are funded separately. The massive spending package comes as the U.S. government is expected to have a higher-than-average budget deficits over the coming decade, fueled in part by diminished revenue resulting from the 2017 Republican tax overhaul. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects the U.S. government will have a budget deficit of $960 billion in the 2019 fiscal year and average annual deficits of $1.2 trillion over the 2020 and 2029 fiscal years. The sprawling package includes $425 million in additional federal grants to help local governments prepare for the November 2020 presidential and congressional elections. Some of the money would be used to harden infrastructure against cyber attacks. following election meddling by Russia in 2016. Negotiators settled on $7.6 billion for conducting next year's census, which is done every 10 years. That would be $1.4 billion more than Trump proposed. The bill also allocates $25 million for federal gun violence research, following a decades-long suspension of such funding. All of the money would fund government programs through September 30th, 2020, the end of the current fiscal year. The legislation would repeal several taxes originally created to help fund the ACA, popularly known as Obamacare, that had been delayed or were only intermittently in effect. It calls for a permanent repeal of the so-called Cadillac tax, a 40% tax on generous health insurance plans. It had aimed to encourage corporations to buy lower-cost plans for employees, but was opposed by many unions that had negotiated their health insurance plans and by businesses who said it was a benefit workers valued. The tax was delayed and never went into effect. The spending bill would also repeal the 2.3% tax on the scale of medical devices such as catheters and pacemakers, which drew opposition from bipartisan lawmakers who said it hurt innovation at medical device companies. Another tax to be repealed is an industry-wide health insurance fee of about 2.5% to 3% of premiums collected.